what's even scarier being a queer reporter, working for a queer publication and being, I'm given the time and the space to like go and find those stories or report on things that other people aren't. But there isn't enough time in the day for all of us at Pink News to cover everything that's happening to the LGBTQ community. And like, what's really terrifying is how much is happening that isn't being reported on because there aren't the resources. Like, it's really cheerful and nice.
Yay,
let's move
on to something more cheerful. Another right we don't have. Hey, it's Rowan. Today I'm here with my friend Vic. They wrote an article the other day that I thought would be interesting to talk about. Vic, what was the article about?
So it was an article for Pink News that I wrote with my friend Amy Ashenden, and it was about how this Pride Month there are still a lot of rights that we don't have as LGBTQ people in the UK.
Which I think a lot of people would find quite surprising because there's this idea that in the UK we're like, oh yes, enlightened and equality and all this stuff. And then when you dig into it, there's actually quite a lot of stuff that isn't quite equal. So what we thought we'd do is basically talk through various examples from the article and talk a little bit about things like the implications behind them, the history behind why these kind of policies have been put in place, and a little bit about maybe the reaction that people have had to the article.
So I think we should start with the fact that gay conversion therapy is still legal in the UK. I think that this was the one that people were most surprised by. Like the most reaction to the article has been like, oh, that's still a thing here, because when you think of gay conversion therapy, I think a lot of people think of America.
Definitely.
The Conservatives said last year that they were going to ban it, but they haven't banned it yet.
So this was something that came out because there was this big survey, the biggest of its kind in the UK, across LGBTQ plus people, and there were a surprising amount of people who had either gone through conversion therapy or been very seriously offered it, and a lot of that had happened in like religious institutions. But I think in the UK there is this idea that it's somehow different here, which just isn't the case.
The NHS and I think lots of like psychological governing bodies whose names I'm not going to try and remember have come out and said like it's not ethical and that they wouldn't do it. And I think they use the definition of using therapy of some kind, whether it's talking therapy or CBT or like in the olden days, but maybe not so much now, like electric shock therapy to convince people that they're not gay. And I know that the journalist Patrick Strudwick, who writes for BuzzFeed, did a kind of undercover like piece, and he found a therapist who said that they could therapize him out of being gay, and he's written about like how bad that was for his mental health. And if you're going to send queer people to therapy, it should be, like you say, it should be therapy that's like, you're queer and this is why it's okay and it's going to be all right, and like here are all these things that are cool. Not like, don't do that, it's bad.
I think we're probably going to find as we go through this list that there are some things that feed into one another. So we already talked before filming, there's like a lot of them to do with trans and non-binary identities. They're all very linked, but I think with these ones it's like, why would someone want to do conversion therapy? So in some cases it is a reason, which is that the community that's around them are against it and therefore they're kind of putting pressure or they're telling people that they need to, but there are some queer people who will want this therapy, and it is because of examples that we'll give of, you know, not having LGBT things talked about in the education system. So if you have a community that's against kind of queerness, if you aren't getting the message from anywhere else that it's actually not the worst and awful thing to be, then that's obviously going to kind of compound the issue. So a lot of these issues that we're going to talk about will sort of affect each other and like have a relationship with each other.
And you also see how they're really linked into like the rest of what's said in public. So if you I don't know if you saw Anne Widdecombe's comments like the other weekend saying, oh, science might yet provide a cure for homosexuality. And I think that, you know, that was bouncing off an article she wrote in 2012 for a newspaper whose name I can't remember, where she defended conversion therapy and said like, some homosexual people are unhappy and they should be allowed to like get therapy to not be gay anymore. And I think you just see how it all ties together, how like what a politician says will tie into homophobic attitudes in certain religious communities, will tie into like certain therapists thinking that you should cure gay people rather than help them be their best selves.
Because historically, like being gay was something that was considered a mental illness in the same way as depression might do. And so I think it has a long, long history that we still aren't over, where it's like we're going to categorise this as something which is kind of a mental illness in and of itself, rather than saying, okay, well, if gay people are more likely to suffer from mental illness. Those are separate things, but it's informed by the amount of homophobia that they're suffering from, the idea that of like compulsory heterosexuality, where they see this life that from when they're born has been told to them is like what a successful and happy life is. And when they realise that they aren't going to have that, and that there isn't an alternative vision of them being happy and successful as a gay person or a queer person, then it might affect their mental health. But it doesn't mean that them being gay is what is making them sad inherently.
I think that what we've done with sexuality, which we haven't done with gender identity yet, is like really separate it out from being medicalised or pathologized.
Yeah.
The idea now of gay conversion therapy, we're like, but being gay isn't an illness that needs curing, so that just seems really obvious to us. Whereas with trans rights now, especially when we see with reform of the Gender Recognition Act, there's still this like, oh, it is kind of medical, like you need to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria, like all of these things. And that is where trans rights are still a bit behind.
This is a good segue into some points that were in the article around kind of rights that trans and non-binary people don't have. Would you like to go into those ones?
Shall I tell you?
Wow, what a good prompt.
Trans rights. If you don't have a gender recognition certificate, and to get a GRC is quite a like long process, you have to be like, it costs money, it takes a long time. Not very many trans people have got one. I think it's like 4,000 or 5,000 in the like 15 years since this law came in. If you don't have a gender recognition certificate, then you will be put into a prison that doesn't match the gender that you identify as or like present as, and lots of trans people don't have a gender recognition certificate. So this means that a lot of trans people, like when they go to prison, they have to wait for like a case meeting to happen before they can be put in like the correct prison for them. And you see, like in 2015, 2 trans women killed themselves because they were put in male prisons. You will only treat someone as their reality if they have this bit of paper, right? Yeah. That's what the current state is like. Whether you're a trans person, you know, who's been out as trans for 5 years or 10 years or forever, like the only thing that will get you treated as that gender is this piece of paper. And like cisgender people don't have to wave a piece of paper around. They don't have to carry their birth certificates with them to be like, hi, I'm Rowan and I'm a woman.
Present
so I would like to be in the ladies' prison.
Yeah.
Which trans people do. So it's like, it's unequal, it's unfair.
So as well as with the prisons, what other kind of things are affected by this sort of policing of trans people and their identity and whether or not they can identify in a certain way or be treated in a certain way just based on like paperwork?
Well, I think a really big one at the moment, like I'm non-binary and legally like my gender isn't recognised in law. So non-binary people on their passports or on any of the forms you fill in for your phone company or your bank or your taxes, like you pick male or female and there aren't any other gender options. And one of the things that the DRA reform could do is legally recognise non-binary people. But separately to that, there's a really amazing non-binary campaigner called Jamie Windust. They have started a petition to get the government to put non-binary gender options on passports, because if you're non-binary,
you essentially have to lie on your passport.
You essentially have to lie. And also if you, depending on how you present, like if you're, say, a very femme-presenting, assigned male at birth, non-binary person, like you can run into a lot of trouble going through passport control. And it's not even that this change would give trans and non-binary people all of the rights that are lacking. It's just that it makes a really public statement from the government of like, we recognise this. And
there's like a precedent saying like, this is like the level that we're at and this is where it should be. So let's have a look at all the stuff that's under it. There's no reason now why all these little bits and bobs shouldn't be happening, because we have said this is the standard.
Yeah, exactly. As is the case with quite a lot of the rights in the article that I wrote, we should look at the situation in Northern Ireland, because I don't know if you know this, I didn't know this before I wrote this article and was kind of shocked, but in the UK, in the rest of the UK, in England, Wales and Scotland, transgender people can't be discriminated against based on their gender identity when they're trying to get housing. But in Northern Ireland, a landlord can legally turn a trans person away because they're trans. Another one of them, which people often forget, is that there is no same-sex marriage in Northern Ireland. 5 years after we passed it in the rest of the UK.
I think that there's a lot of these kind of disparities between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK in terms of that people don't know about it, they don't really think about it, because there's this idea of like, oh, if it's happened in England, that's where the government is, right? That's how it all must happen, and like that's not how it works. And I think there's a lot of stuff that's happening as close as Northern Ireland to us, let alone in the rest of the world, that we just don't necessarily know about or think about.
Another thing that came up when I was writing this is looking at the HIV prevention drug PrEP. I have gay male friends who take PrEP. It's like a daily pill that if you're at high risk of being exposed to HIV, so like gay and bisexual men are at a high risk of being exposed to it, then it's basically a small blue pill that you can take every day, and it means that you won't get HIV. So sounds pretty good, right?
Works for me.
Like, sounds pretty great. Like, lots of people in the queer community have died from HIV, and there is this pill that means that you won't get it. However, it's not widely accessible. Basically, they're arguing over who's going to fund it, and the Conservatives are like, we don't want to pay for it. So they've been running trials of it, but they've basically already filled all of the spaces on all of the trials. So their clinics, especially in London, are turning away gay and bisexual men who are like, hey, I'm at high risk of getting HIV. Like, may I have this drug that will stop me getting it? And people are like, no, because we don't have any more, because there are rows over who will pay for it.
It's so scary looking at the future of like healthcare, because there are things like this where it's like, if it's not to do with the community who are going to be prioritised, like how does that work within a capitalist system of like who's got the most money, therefore who's contributing to the system more, therefore who deserves to live more. Wow, okay, cool, this is fine, everything's fine.
Everything's cheerful.
Great. It just feels like if you have this medication that can help eradicate something which has been so globally devastating, why wouldn't you fund it?
Let's talk about how queer people meet other queer people, and how a lot of the time that happens in queer spaces, which are often like bars and pubs. And I know that there is a LGBTQ community centre being developed at the moment, and that is going to be fully accessible, which is great because, surprise, there are no LGBTQ venues in central London that are fully accessible, which means that any LGBTQ people who are also have accessibility requirements, they can't get into those spaces.
Which means they can't socialise in person in queer specific spaces, which is a big deal.
Yeah.
And I think especially like another thing that's on the list, but I think it ties into this, the idea of like being safe on public transport. I think a lot of people have seen the attack onto women on a bus in London, but if you can't be openly queer and feel safe in just general outdoor spaces, in bars and clubs that are for straight people, they're not called straight clubs, but they are straight clubs.
The default.
Like if you want to socialise somewhere with queer people that isn't the internet, going to an actual venue is kind of the place to do it.
Yeah.
And if you can't do it, you literally cannot because it's not accessible. Like, what are you meant to do?
If you're like gender non-conforming and you don't feel safe in those straight spaces, or if you want to go on a date with someone, like you want to be able to hold hands with someone of the same sex, so you want to be in a queer pub where you're not going to get like straight men leching over you while you do that.
And you want to feel safe when you do it.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those things where accessibility is going to affect like anyone queer or not across London. Like there's so many places that aren't accessible in London in general, but I think it's one of those examples of where people's kind of marginalisations and identities can impact on each other. Really specifically for within our community, there is the issue of the fact that if you can't get into any of these spaces, that like potentially you put yourself in danger, or you just don't get to socialise, which is just like is unacceptable to me.
There have been some accessible queer venues that are closing. So like a lot of London venues are closing anyway, but like disproportionately the number of LGBTQ venues,
and the effect is
more,
disproportionate,
and
as
it's
well.
because it's serving like a specific community. But like, for example, the Hackney showrooms were fully accessible, but they've just shut. Let's talk about sex, baby. Let's talk about you and me.
Just straight into the point.
Sex education, sex and relationship education in the UK hasn't been updated since when, Rowan?
A long time ago?
Since 2000. Since before Section 28 was repealed. So
Cool. Okay, so Section 28 is something I have talked about many times on this channel because I think it has had a profound effect on like my life and the life of many LGBT people in the UK. Essentially, it was a local government's act that prohibited the promotion of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. So basically, in effect, teachers, librarians felt like they could not talk about being gay in a positive way in schools. So this would often manifest in like ignoring homophobic bullying, not feeling like they could give advice that was positive to if a student came to them and came out to them, definitely not talking about being gay in any of the subjects, including, you know, talking about an author that you're studying who might have been gay, or gay themes in books, things like that. These are all things that teachers felt like it might be dangerous for them to talk about lest they lose their jobs. And also obviously affected the training that was happening. So you could have teachers who were trained within that period who would then not necessarily get training afterwards in order to correct all the stuff they've been told previously, all the things they hadn't been told that they could talk about. So they felt like they weren't qualified to challenge homophobia even after this was repealed in the 2000s.
So the last time sex and relationships education was updated was, before this was repealed. So at the moment, sex and relationships education, nothing about the lesbians, the gays, the bis, the trans. And that is really scary. It means that for a lot of us, the first time that you learn about the gay sex or the gay relationship is when you're doing one, or you see it on the internet. MPs did recently vote to include LGBTQ relationships in sex and relationships education, which they are planning to make compulsory, but it's not going to be brought in until next year at least. There are protests happening at the moment outside primary schools in Birmingham and Manchester, and they're not protesting like LGBT sex education, they're protesting lessons that are inclusive of LGBT people, which is, for example, like...
And that are age appropriate.
Yeah, that are age appropriate. So it's like, you know, classes of 6-year-olds, like some of the books that they're reading will have like 2 mums preparing a picnic together, or like 2 dads who are like 2 dads to the child. And a lot of the protesting is really sexualized. It's really sexualizing that content and being like, our children are too young to learn about like how gay men have sex or this or that. And that really feeds into that like lack of awareness and knowledge of like, queer people aren't just, it's not just sex. Sexuality is like, it's about love and intimacy and like just being.
And when you don't address those issues directly in schools, you have kids who grow up to become the parents who then protest at schools for their kids. I've done a video that's all about the history of homophobia in education. I will link that somewhere, but that goes into this in more detail. But yeah, so I mean, hopefully this is coming in next year, but I also have some worries that there's going to be some kind of issue that will come up before then.
One of the things that also came up that feeds into this is when you look at the 2 women who were attacked on a bus in kind of like a homophobic incident, the boys that attacked them were like, I think they were 15 to 18 years old. And you had all these politicians come out and be like, this is so shocking in 2019 in the UK that this happens. But like, this does happen. And the fact that the perpetrators were so young just shows how important it is that people learn at school that like LGBT people exist and they should have the right to travel on a bus safely in the same way that everybody else does.
Well, like, interestingly, all of that, if you've got a 15-year-old who's done that, they've been in the education system post Section 28, right? So theoretically, we should have, once Section 28 was repealed, put in place something that meant that we don't have 15-year-olds today that think this is acceptable. And I think that we just didn't get anything to replace it. And so although technically we can be like, oh yeah, because we don't have this law anymore, it must be fine. And I think you actually need to work at something when you have people who have historically been marginalised and kind of touted in public as being dangerous and being like sexually predatory and all this kind of stuff, that actually you need to actively combat that with the truth rather than just assuming that everyone will just work it out for themselves. This is the bare minimum, people, and we can't even do that.
Let's talk about Numbers. Rowan.
I love maths.
I can tell. How many LGBTQ people are there in the UK?
Well, that's something that we can't tell because we don't know. And this is something that's really frustrating because you have so many studies that are conducted that are like unofficial studies and which don't go across a whole population. They'll take a sample size and be like, we can extrapolate it. But different areas getting kind of having that survey done will probably report differently. So if you're going to take a survey in San Francisco, for example, if you're doing it in the States, you can't then extrapolate that out to the rest of the country and kind of vice versa, especially because if you are LGBT, you're not necessarily going to out yourself on a kind of a study that's someone has come to you with a clipboard and been like, hello, we're just doing a survey of the area. Are you a gay? Like, let me tick, thank you so much. So yeah, we don't know. And there are wild percentages that get thrown around. Some people are like, it's 0.5%, and some people are like, it's 20%. And I'm like, that's a big difference in numbers, gang. And that has but it, like, we were talking about this before we started filming, but that has a massive effect, because if you can say with like definitively, this is how many people are going to be affected by this legislation or this law, that is something that is hugely useful. And it's just something that, I don't know, I feel like you're about to tell me we don't have currently.
Yes, so we don't have it. I think it's important to note that we probably couldn't ever have it definitively. What's being proposed at the moment, or what's just passed in Scotland, is there's going to be a voluntary question on their next census asking people, you know, are they LGBT? Like, what's their sexuality and what's their gender identity? Do they have like a trans history or a trans status? And it's really important to note that it is voluntary. So they're not going to punish people if they don't answer. They're not going to out people against their consent. But that's not something that's currently recorded anywhere, right? So like the census is kind of the gold standard for like information about the population, and it doesn't ask those questions. So I find when I'm writing I write a lot about trans issues, and a lot of the time the editor will say to me like, oh, could you just put in like how many people will be affected by this, or like how many trans people are there in London, or like how many non-binary people are there in England, Wales? And I'm like, we literally don't know. Like,
who can tell?
Estimates vary from like 200,000 to upwards of 1 million, and especially with trans and non-binary issues, it would actually be really helpful if we knew how many of us there were, because at the moment there's a real lack in services for that community. So for example, there are only 7 gender identity clinics in England, and this is where trans people can get referred to go on like hormones, or to go on a waiting list for top surgery, etc., etc. But the waiting list at each of these now is like 2-3 years maybe for a first appointment, and like,
which is way above the NHS standard waiting time, because they have NHS has waiting times that are like, this is what is acceptable, this is the maximum waiting time.
It's supposed to be 18 weeks.
Trans stuff is
weeks.
So far
but
beyond
it's like
that.
3 years. And so knowing the trans population would be really useful, because then you could say, actually, we should really have another GIC in this place and this place and this place, because this is where the like trans population is concentrated. Or even to be able to write in an article, like, that is 100,000 patients per GIC, which it probably is.
Yeah.
Let's talk about homeless people.
Yes. And how disproportionately they are LGBTQ plus people, because that's like a huge kind of population that have, I think when people think about homelessness, they think about people who are sleeping rough, but there's like so many other people. So there's a lot of queer people who are sleeping rough, but then a lot who are like couch surfing, who have no permanent residence, who are having to like stay on a friend's floor, and a lot of that is because, again, of these compounded effects of homophobia, which is ingrained within society because of a lack of talking about it openly in education, and these myths are perpetuated by the idea that we're dangerous or that we're kind of sexually predatory, and like all of this stuff again just compounds itself to the point where people feel like they are like unsafe at home. Especially youth homelessness is like a massive issue for queer people. The statistic that I've used before that I put in this article is that 24% of young homeless people in the UK are LGBTQ. I wouldn't be surprised if it was higher as well. And those people, the majority of them, you know, tell researchers that the reason that they're homeless is because of their sexuality or gender identity, and because they're young,
and they were like chucked out of the family home, or their family disowned them, or they felt unsafe to remain in that environment.
If it's unsafe to be on public transport or to be out publicly as a queer person, how much more dangerous does that become as someone who is constantly public, as someone who doesn't necessarily have a safe refuge to go home to? How does that kind of, what effect does that have as well, is something that I think, because we are relying on charities who are providing resources to try and do this research, I feel like there's a load of effects that we probably don't even know yet, because people just haven't had the funding yet to go in and be like, oh, what is the actual effect that this is having on the population. So the final one that we're going to finish on is something which has genuinely made me so angry when I found out about it when I was like a teenager. So you cannot be a man who has had sex with a man in the last 3 months and donate blood, which effectively says that if you're a gay man who's sexually active in a committed relationship where you have sex, you effectively can't donate blood. Which is horrendous, like actually horrendous.
It's something that I think when people hear about it, it makes them really angry. Like, I have a couple of straight friends who I went on holiday with a few weeks ago, and we were talking about this, and I don't think that they knew that this was the case. And I've never seen a group of people get like angrier faster, because it's just completely discriminatory. It's like, oh, if you're a gay or bi man, like, your blood is contaminated, like, we don't want your blood, even when there's a national blood shortage.
And even when the blood is tested.
Yeah, the blood is screened.
I think that I remember, so one of the reasons why in recent years that this was in such like sharp relief was after Orlando, because I know this is obviously in the US, but this is the case in like, I don't know how many states in the US, but there were these, you have people who are like, my friends are like in hospital, and the hospitals are saying they need blood, and as a queer person I can't donate to save my friend's life. Like, it's so horrendous at a point in which this is something that we need, and we're turning people away just because of their identity. It isn't based on behaviour, right? So it isn't saying if you have had, it's not asking you about whether you've had sex with a condom or not, or whether you're having protected sex. It's just like any sex. This is what we think about. I think historically, when we think about the idea of the AIDS crisis and the idea of like gay men and queer men being seen as dirty because of it, all of these hang-ups that we've had have kind of followed them to the point where it has no basis in the reality of the risk of donating blood. And yet there are still seemingly some people who just have a feeling about it. They're just like, oh, it just feels like it might be dangerous. And I'm like, but it's not. So it's literally just discrimination. That's it.
And I think one way of being really clear about how that is discrimination is to use an example of like another population, like another demographic. And that's, you could look at loads, but like, let's take students. So like statistically, the student population is more likely to have an STI or an STD than the rest of the population. But you don't get blood banks saying, if you're a student, you can't give us your blood if you've had sex in the last 3 months.
In fact, they do targeted blood drives at universities.
Yeah, they do.
Like they go out of their way to get that blood. So
it's the double standard of like, the gay people are treated worse than the I mean, you can be gay and a student, but yeah. So this was really cheerful.
Yeah, thank you for coming onto this channel and spreading some joy. But I think that it's the more these things are coming to light, the more that people can say, actually, this is something that I want to commit myself to campaigning for, or that I want to donate to, or that I want to learn more about, or have discussions about with, you know, my straight and cis friends, and get them like kind of outraged about this as they should be. So I think although it's really depressing to hear, it's also quite useful to know this stuff about what's going on in the community.
So the idea for the piece that I wrote for Pink News came from this tweet that Amy did. And she wrote under the tweet, like, all these like queer run or queer led like charities and activist groups that, you know, if any of these issues have made you be like, wow, that's really horrendous, I feel really angry, like, there are places where you can give money to people who are working on these issues, and absolutely, that would be great.
So yeah, that's the end of the list. Again, like, the article will be linked below if you want to read it. I guess in the comments, if you want to talk about like any of these things that really surprised you that you didn't know about, I'd be really interested to see what stuff people weren't aware of. And until I see you next time, bye!